He said it without turning around. He didn't know she was standing directly behind him. It was the height of the London season, in the year 1819, and Lady Featherington's ballroom stood packed to its gilded edges with the whole glittering weight of society's better families, when Marcus Faircross, Duke of Rothwell, made the remark that would define the whole of the following month. He had not meant it as an insult calculated to reach any particular ear. He had simply been standing at the edge of the dance floor with his old friend Lord Aldous, complaining, in the careless, half-audible way of a man who has forgotten a crowded room carries sound in unpredictable directions, about the tedious necessity of standing up with every fresh face his hostess pressed upon him that season. "I have danced with every marriageable woman in 3 counties this month, Aldous, and I find I have exhausted my patience for the whole exercise," Marcus said. "Lady Featherington has just informed me she means to introduce Lady Kestrel next, and I confess I would rather sit out the remainder of the evening entirely. I would not dance with her if she were the last woman here." He did not know, saying it, that Lady Kestrel herself stood not 3 feet behind him, having arrived at his shoulder in the press of the crowd a moment before he spoke, close enough to hear every careless word of it plainly. The music, which had paused between sets, began again in that same instant, a bright, deliberate opening flourish that seemed, to every guest who marked the timing, to underscore the remark with a cruelty the Duke himself had not intended, but could not now take back. Marcus turned, drawn by some prickling awareness of a presence behind him, and found himself looking directly into the composed, entirely unsurprised face of Seraphina Kestrel, who had heard every word and given no sign of it at all, beyond a single slow blink, as though filing the remark away for later, careful consideration. "Your Grace," Seraphina said, with perfect, devastating civility, "I find I am equally relieved. I had not the smallest intention of dancing with a man who cannot be troubled to check who stands behind him before he speaks so freely. The narrator will tell you plainly what half that ballroom already understood, and Marcus Faircross was only beginning to grasp, that Lady Seraphina Kestrel was not merely another marriageable widow to be endured through an obligatory turn about the floor, but the single most quietly influential woman in London that season. A woman whose good opinion determined, with a precision no title alone could match, which families received vouchers to the season's most exclusive gatherings, which young ladies were considered truly eligible rather than merely wealthy, and which gentlemen found doors open to them that no amount of rank could otherwise unlock. She held that influence not through any office or title beyond her own late husband's modest earldom, but through a decade of careful, deliberate cultivation, an unerring judgment of character, a memory for every family's true history rather than its polished public face, and a willingness to withhold her favor from anyone, however grand, who proved unworthy of it. Duchesses courted her good opinion as assiduously as debutantes did. The season's hostesses consulted her, quietly and without ever quite admitting it aloud, before finalizing their own guest lists. For a gathering Lady Kestrel declined to attend was a gathering the rest of society quietly began to wonder about. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Lady Kestrel simply turned from the Duke of Rothwell with the same unhurried composure she had greeted his remark, and crossed the ballroom to where her particular circle of friends and dependents waited. A young widow she had quietly sponsored into her first season, a merchant's clever daughter whose family fortune had never quite bought her proper standing until Seraphina's patronage secured it, 2 matrons whose own daughters owed their happiest matches to a word dropped in the right ear at the right moment, and within the space of perhaps 10 minutes, every soul in that crowded room who mattered to the season's proper functioning had heard, in careful whispered relay, exactly what the Duke of Rothwell had said, and exactly whose ear it had reached. By midnight, Marcus Faircross stood at the edge of a ballroom, in which every eye followed Lady Seraphina Kestrel, and not one followed him at all. For she danced, that evening, with every gentleman of consequence present save the one who had declared he would not have her, laughing easily with Lord Aldous, charming a visiting foreign diplomat into a lively discussion of the evening's music, drawing even the notoriously reserved Bishop of Denbigh into an animated exchange over the punch bowl, and each dance seemed to the watching room a small deliberate demonstration of exactly how thoroughly a woman of true influence could render a duke's careless remark not merely rude, but irrelevant. It was, Marcus reflected grimly, watching from the punch table as his own friend Lord Aldous led Lady Kestrel through a lively country dance with evident delight, precisely the reckoning his own careless tongue had earned him. And he had a very great deal of the evening left in which to sit with the discomfort of it. Before the last set of that long, humbling evening had finished, Marcus Faircross had resolved upon a course of action he would spend the following weeks executing with considerably more patience than he had shown standing at the edge of that dance floor. If a story of a careless remark answered not with fury, but with quiet, devastating composure, is the kind that keeps you listening. Stay. What followed changed the whole shape of Marcus Faircross's season. He called upon Lady Kestrel 3 days later, properly, with his card sent ahead and no illusions remaining about the reception he might expect, and was kept waiting in her drawing-room a full quarter-hour before she consented to receive him at all. A delay, he understood, rightly, as a small further correction rather than mere social carelessness on her part. She kept him waiting deliberately, the quarter-hour stretching long enough that Marcus had time to rehearse and discard 3 separate opening speeches before she finally appeared, composed and entirely unhurried, and settled herself across from him with the particular unbothered patience of a woman who had weathered a great many awkward interviews in her time, and found this one no more taxing than the rest. "I have not come to apologize in the ordinary fashion, Lady Kestrel," Marcus said, once she had finally received him, "because I find an ordinary apology insults us both. You do not require my regret over a remark you have already answered, publicly and thoroughly, with considerably more grace than I showed making it. I have come instead to ask you a plain question, and I would be obliged if you would answer it as plainly as you answered me at Lady Featherington's ball." He held her steady, assessing gaze without flinching from it. "Why does my opinion of you matter so little that you did not trouble to correct me directly, and instead let the whole of society do the correcting for you?" Something in Seraphina's composed face shifted, very slightly at the question, not softening precisely, but sharpening with a new attention. Because a woman who corrects a duke directly, to his face, in front of witnesses, is called shrewish for her trouble, however justified the correction, Seraphina said. A woman who says nothing at all and simply lets the truth of the matter travel on its own considerable legs is called nothing worse than quiet, and accomplishes, in the end, precisely the same correction with none of the cost to her own reputation. I have spent 10 years since my husband's death learning exactly which battles are worth fighting loudly and which are better won in silence, Your Grace. Yours was never going to be worth raising my voice over. And is there any battle, Marcus asked, that you consider worth fighting loudly? When someone I have decided to protect is genuinely threatened, Seraphina said, without hesitation, I have been known to raise my voice a very great deal. You may ask Lord Pemberley's mother, who once attempted to force a match between her son and a young woman half his age and entirely against her own wishes. I did not manage that correction quietly at all, and Lady Pemberley has not troubled a young woman's family without proper leave since. Marcus found himself, rather to his own surprise, laughing outright at the image of it. I begin to suspect I got off rather lightly, being merely humiliated at a ball. You did, Your Grace, Seraphina agreed, entirely unrepentant. Consider it a mercy earned by the fact that your offense, however careless, harmed no one but your own vanity. Marcus Faircross left that first call considerably more intrigued than chastened, and returned the following week with a genuine question about a mutual acquaintance's difficulty rather than any further attempt at apology. And Seraphina, recognizing in the visit a man who had at least begun to understand the difference between seeking forgiveness and seeking her actual company, received him with somewhat less frost than the first occasion had shown. "You have not apologized again," she observed, pouring tea with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. "I decided one honest reckoning was worth more than a dozen repeated apologies," Marcus said. "I find groveling tiresome to deliver, and I suspect it is a great deal more tiresome to receive, particularly from a woman clever enough to see through the performance of it at 20 paces. That is the first genuinely sensible thing you have said to me, Your Grace," Seraphina said, and there was, for the first time, the ghost of real warmth beneath her composure. It was over the weeks that followed, in a careful, wary courtship conducted largely through mutual acquaintances' drawing rooms and the occasional supervised walk in the park, each visit a little less guarded than the last, that Marcus began to understand the whole architecture of what Seraphina Kestrel had built in the decade since her husband's death. Not merely social influence for its own sake, but a quiet, deliberate network of protection for exactly the kind of overlooked, undervalued young women's society was so ready to dismiss. Families whose daughters might otherwise have been talked into poor matches or excluded from opportunities their character deserved, all managed through Seraphina's own careful patronage without a single public announcement of the good she was doing. "You have built an entire shadow court," Marcus said one afternoon, watching her write out, with brisk efficiency, a letter of introduction on behalf of a merchant's daughter he had never heard mentioned in any drawing-room gossip. A season's worth of influence, spent entirely on people the rest of society would never trouble to notice. "I was overlooked myself once, Your Grace, before my marriage gave me the standing to be otherwise," Seraphina said, not looking up from her letter. "My own family had modest means and no particular consequence, and I spent 2 full seasons watching grander women receive every consideration I was quietly denied, for no better reason than an accident of birth neither of us chose. I promised myself, once I had the power to change that calculation for anyone else, that I would spend it generously rather than hoard it the way most of society hoards every advantage it is given." "And your husband?" Marcus asked, carefully. "Did he share that conviction? Or did you build it alone after his death?" Edmund was a gentle, unambitious man who loved his books and his gardens a great deal more than he ever loved society's games, Seraphina said, a fondness entering her voice that told Marcus plainly the marriage had been a genuinely happy one, whatever its practical origins. "He gave me his name and his rank and a household of my own to manage exactly as I saw fit, and asked for very little in return beyond my company at supper and my patience with his roses. I built the rest of this myself, in the years since, because I found I had inherited both the standing and the restlessness to do something useful with it, and a decade of quiet grief seemed a poor excuse not to." "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that is the first time I have heard a woman describe widowhood as an opportunity rather than a diminishment." "It was both, Your Grace," Seraphina said. "I do not pretend the grief was not real. I only refused to let it be the whole of my story." Their conversations, over the weeks that followed, grew steadily less guarded, and it was on one such afternoon, walking the length of Hyde Park with her maid trailing at a discreet distance behind them, that Marcus found himself telling Seraphina things he had not spoken aloud to any living soul, of a father who had taught him that a duke's worth lay entirely in his consequence and never once in his character, of the particular loneliness of a title that drew every eye and earned, Marcus had come slowly to suspect very little of anyone's genuine regard. "I have spent my whole life being agreed with," Marcus admitted, "which I begin to understand is a great deal closer to being ignored than anyone ever troubles to tell a duke. You are the first person in a decade who has told me plainly that I was wrong about something, and I confess I found the experience considerably more bracing than insulting, once the sting of it passed. I imagine that says a great deal more about the company you have been keeping than it does about my own candor," Seraphina said, though she was smiling now, unguarded in a way Marcus had not yet seen from her in public. There came an afternoon some weeks into that careful courtship when the businesslike distance between them nearly gave way entirely. Marcus had come to report some small success in a matter Seraphina had asked his help with, a young man's commission secured through the Duke's own connections, at her quiet request, and found her in her garden rather than her drawing room, working among the late roses with her sleeves pushed back, and her usual careful composure loosened by the private warmth of an afternoon she had not expected company for. "You look considerably less like the most feared woman in London out here," Marcus said, "and considerably more like someone I would very much like to know better." "I am rarely feared, Your Grace," Seraphina said, though a faint colour had risen in her face at the observation. "I am simply attended to, which most gentlemen mistake for the same thing." He came nearer than the afternoon strictly required, close enough that neither of them moved to widen the distance again, the late sun catching gold in loose strands of her hair, and for a long suspended moment the whole quiet garden held its breath around the narrow space between them. It would have taken nothing at all to close it. His hand rose, almost, toward her cheek, and hers lifted, uncertain, neither quite reaching to stop him, nor quite inviting him further. "I have spent a decade being extremely careful about exactly this kind of moment, Your Grace," Seraphina said, low, not stepping back, but not closing the distance either. "I find I do not know how to be careless with it, even now, even with you." "Then we shall simply have to be careful together," Marcus said, and stepped back himself, though it cost him visibly to do it, until careful no longer feels like the only safe way to do this. It was into this careful, deepening arrangement that Lady Priscilla Faircross, the Duke's own aunt, inserted herself, and the whole tenor of the season changed with her. Lady Priscilla had spent 3 years quietly engineering a match between her nephew and her own goddaughter, Miss Henrietta Vane, a pretty, biddable young woman whose family's fortune would settle nicely alongside the Rothwell estate's own considerable holdings, arranging seating at every dinner she could influence, dropping careful hints to mutual acquaintances, cultivating in her nephew a familiarity with Henrietta's company that she had believed, until this season, was quietly ripening into the attachment she intended. She had watched the growing talk of her nephew's attentions to Lady Kestrel with a mounting alarm that had nothing to do with propriety, and a great deal to do with the collapse of 3 years' patient scheming. For Henrietta Vane's own fortune, considerable as it was, could do nothing to compete with a widow whose influence over the whole season's marriage market made her, in Priscilla's private calculation, a rival of an entirely different order than any mere heiress. Her first move was subtle. She called upon several of Seraphina's own particular circle, under the guise of ordinary social visiting, and let fall, with careful, wounded concern, her fear that dear Lady Kestrel's influence over the Duke might not be entirely disinterested, that a widow with such considerable social power might find a Duke's attentions a very convenient means of extending that power still further. Whatever genuine feeling she claimed to hold, the suggestion found some soil to take root in among a few of the season's more envious tongues, and Seraphina, hearing the whisper traced back to its source within days, addressed it with the same composed directness she brought to every difficulty. Your aunt has been telling certain households that I court your attentions for the sake of extending my own influence, Your Grace, Seraphina said, when Marcus called next. I do not ask you to silence her. I am considerably more capable of managing my own reputation than any duke's protection could accomplish. I tell you only so that you understand precisely what your family is prepared to say of me, before this goes any further between us. I am aware of my aunt's ambitions regarding Miss Vane, Marcus said. Grim, I had not realized she would stoop to attacking your character to secure them. Lady Priscilla's second move, 3 weeks later, was considerably less subtle and a great deal more dangerous. Having failed to turn the season's gossip decisively against Seraphina through mere suggestion, she pressed further, calling in old acquaintance with a solicitor who had once handled the estate of Seraphina's late husband, and pieced together, from selectively presented fragments of the old earl's private financial troubles, a story calculated to suggest that Seraphina herself had known of and concealed her husband's considerable debts before his death. Allowing his creditors to be quietly settled through means Lady Priscilla implied, without ever quite stating outright, had not been entirely honest. The rumor spread through the season with alarming speed, precisely because it touched upon exactly the kind of financial impropriety society considered unforgivable in a woman who had built her whole standing upon unimpeachable judgment and honesty. And Seraphina found herself, within a fortnight, facing the very real possibility that a decade's carefully built influence might collapse entirely under an accusation she had not yet had proper opportunity to answer. It was Seraphina herself, rather than Marcus, who moved first and fastest to unravel it. She summoned her late husband's own solicitor, the genuine one, an elderly and scrupulously honest man named Mr. Whitcomb, who had managed the Earl's estate for 30 years and laid before him the whole shape of Lady Priscilla's accusation, and asked him, plainly, to produce whatever records would settle the matter beyond any further dispute. Your husband's debts were settled, Lady Kestrel, exactly as the estate's own accounts have always shown, through the sale of the unentailed Yorkshire property, a transaction I myself witnessed and recorded within a month of his death, Mr. Whitcomb said, examining his own decade-old ledgers with the particular satisfaction of a man about to correct a considerable injustice. You knew nothing of the debts before his death, my lady, because your husband kept them from you deliberately, out of his own shame at the mismanagement. And you discovered them only after, and settled them with a promptness and honesty that did you very great credit at the time. I confess I am at a loss to understand how anyone could construct a story of concealment from a record so plainly showing the opposite. Lady Priscilla has, I believe, spoken to a junior clerk in your former office, Mr. Whitcomb, rather than to you directly, Seraphina said, piecing the whole scheme together with the same careful attention she brought to every crisis. A young man new enough to the practice not to know the full history, shown only the bare fact of the debt and the date of the sale, and left to draw whatever unflattering inference seemed most convenient to whoever was asking the questions. That would explain a great deal, Whitcomb said grimly. I dismissed that particular clerk myself, not 4 months past, for carelessness with confidential papers. I had not realized the carelessness had found so profitable a second use. Seraphina brought Mr. Whitcomb's full account before a gathering of the season's most influential hostesses herself. At a tea she arranged with characteristic composure rather than any public confrontation, and laid the whole truth before them with the same unhurried clarity she had once used to answer a duke's careless remark. Lady Priscilla has told certain households that I concealed my late husband's debts, Seraphina said to the assembled company. Mr. Whitcomb's ledgers open before them. The truth, as his own solicitor's 30 years of scrupulous record-keeping shows plainly, is that I discovered those debts only after his death, and settled every farthing of them within the year, at some genuine cost to my own comfort. because I believed then, as I believe now, that a family's honor is not preserved by hiding its failures, but by answering them honestly. I do not ask you to take my word for it. I ask you to examine the record yourselves and judge which of us, myself, or the woman who constructed this story from selectively chosen fragments to protect her own scheme for her goddaughter, has actually behaved with the honesty this season claims to value so highly. The tea room, which had gathered expecting merely to hear Seraphina's defense, instead witnessed her calm, thorough demolition of Lady Priscilla's whole fabricated narrative. The ledgers passed hand to hand among the assembled hostesses. Mr. Whitcomb's own written testimony read aloud in full. Every careful implication Priscilla had planted answered, with a precision that left no comfortable ambiguity for anyone in the room to retreat into. One of the season's sharpest-tongued dowagers, a woman Seraphina counted neither friend nor enemy, but whose judgment carried particular weight, set down her own teacup with a decisive click. I confess I repeated the story myself, to my shame, the dowager said, believing it came from a source close enough to the family to be trusted. I find I owe you a rather public correction, Lady Kestrel, and I mean to deliver it at the very next gathering I attend, to precisely the same ears that first heard the falsehood from me. It was exactly the kind of restitution Seraphina had hoped for, without ever presuming to ask for it directly, and the story that travelled outward from that gathering carried, within days, an entirely different verdict than the one Priscilla Faircross had spent a fortnight carefully constructing. Not merely Seraphina's vindication, but a fuller understanding, rippling through every drawing room that mattered, of exactly how far the Duke's own aunt had been willing to reach in service of an ambition that had nothing to do with her nephew's genuine happiness. Marcus confronted his aunt directly once the truth had fully emerged, in a private interview that cost their family relationship a good deal of its former warmth. Lady Priscilla, cornered, attempted first denial, and then, when the dismissed clerk's own account confirmed the whole scheme beyond doubt, a wounded appeal to family loyalty that Marcus found he had no patience left to honor. You very nearly destroyed a decade of a good woman's honest work, aunt, over a match you engineered for your own goddaughter's advantage rather than any genuine care for my happiness, Marcus said. I have watched you manage this family's affairs my whole life with a confidence I mistook, until this month, for wisdom. I find it was merely will, exercised without any particular regard for whether the people beneath it wanted managing at all. I will not forget this, and I will not permit you further influence over any matter touching Lady Kestrel, now or after we are married. Lady Priscilla, her scheme exposed, and her own standing considerably diminished by the season's collective judgment, withdrew from London society for the remainder of the year, and Miss Henrietta Vane, mortified by the whole affair, made a happier match the following season with a gentleman of her own genuine choosing rather than her godmother's engineering. It was that same evening, in Seraphina's own drawing room, with the truth fully vindicated and the season's opinion decisively turned in her favour, that Marcus Faircross finally said the thing he had been building toward for weeks. I said, at Lady Featherington's ball, that I would not dance with you if you were the last woman here, Marcus said. I have spent every week since discovering that you are, in fact, the only woman in London I have any genuine wish to dance with at all, and I find the whole of my former carelessness rather difficult to forgive myself for, given how completely I have been proven wrong. He drew from his coat a small folded card. I have secured, with some effort, the last dance at tomorrow's assembly. I am asking you properly this time, with the whole of the room free to hear it. Will you dance with me, Seraphina? Not to settle an old debt of manners, but because I have fallen entirely in love with the most quietly powerful woman I have ever met, and I find I would like the whole of society to watch me finally get it right. Seraphina drew from her own reticule the black lace fan that had belonged to her mother. worn soft at its ribs from 30 years of careful use, and opened it slowly, a gesture Marcus had learned by then that in the silent language of her particular circle signaled unmistakable, delighted acceptance. "I find I am persuaded, Your Grace," she said, and the kiss that followed, quiet and certain in the lamplit drawing room, broke open in Seraphina the plain astonishment of being chosen, not despite her formidable reputation, but entirely because of it, by a man who had finally learned to value exactly what the whole of society already knew, to fear and respect in equal measure. They danced the final set at the very next assembly, in front of the same crowded ballroom that had watched the Duke's careless remark travel its humbling course weeks before. And this time, every eye in the room watched them both together, and not one whisper of the evening carried anything but genuine delight. Lady Featherington herself, hosting the assembly where the whole affair had begun, remarked to a circle of her closest friends that she had never in 30 seasons of hosting witnessed a courtship the ton had followed with such collective, gleeful investment, nor one that had ended so thoroughly to everyone's satisfaction, save the one relation who had tried hardest to prevent it. They were married that autumn at St. George's, with the whole of the season's most influential hostesses in attendance, not merely out of obligation, but out of genuine affection for a woman who had spent a decade quietly championing their own overlooked daughters and nieces. And Marcus found, standing at that altar, that he had gained through his marriage not merely a wife, but an entire extended circle of women who regarded him now with considerably warmer eyes than his own careless remark had once earned him. Seraphina did not abandon her careful patronage once married. If anything, a duke's own considerable resources joined to her existing influence, she found she could do a great deal more good for the young women and struggling families who had long relied upon her quiet championship. And Marcus, having learned his lesson thoroughly, made a habit of consulting her judgment on every matter of consequence rather than merely his own, discovering, to his genuine surprise, that a marriage built on being corrected honestly suited him a great deal better than the comfortable agreement he had spent his whole life mistaking for respect. Lady Priscilla Faircross returned to London society 2 years later, chastened and considerably diminished in influence, and made her peace with her nephew slowly, through small gestures rather than any grand reconciliation, and Seraphina, who had never been a woman inclined to hold a grudge past its usefulness, received her eventually with a civility that cost her nothing, and mended, by degrees, a family relationship that might otherwise have remained broken for good. Miss Henrietta Vane, freed from her godmother's engineering, wrote to Seraphina herself the following year to thank her, with evident sincerity, for the accidental favor of having ended an arrangement neither she nor Marcus had ever truly wanted. Seraphina's black lace fan hung ever after in a small glass case in the Rothwell drawing room, beside the very ballroom announcement card from the evening it had all begun, a small permanent reminder. Marcus told every guest who asked after the story of the night he learned to check who was standing behind him before he ever spoke carelessly again, and of the woman who had taught him, in the humbling weeks that followed, that the quietest power in any room was very often the truest, and very rarely the one a careless man thought to fear until it was already standing directly behind him.